Chapter 27 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by A. Maynard Barber. Chapter 27. The Silent Witness. Approaching footsteps were heard, but they were the steps of men moving slowly and unsteadily, as though carrying some heavy burden. An instant later, 6 men, bearing a casket, beneath whose weight they staggered, entered the courtroom, and making their way through the spellbound crowd, deposited their burden near the witness stand. Immediately following were 2 men, one of whom was instantly recognized as Merrick, the detective, the other as the man who, a few months before, had been known as the English barrister's clerk, now wearing the full uniform of a Scotland Yard official. Bringing up the rear was an undertaker, who, amid the breathless silence which ensued, proceeded to open the casket. This done, Mr. Sutherland rose and addressed the judge, his low tones for the first time vibrating with suppressed feeling. Your Honor, I request that William H. Whitney be first called upon to identify the witness. Controlling his agitation by a visible effort, Mr. Whitney approached the casket, but his eyes no sooner rested on the form and features within that his forced composure gave way. With a groan, he exclaimed, "My God! It is Hugh Mainwaring!" And bending over the casket, he covered his face with his hands while he strove in vain to conceal his emotion. His words, ringing through the hushed courtroom, seemed to break the spell, and the overwrought nerves of the people began to yield under the tremendous pressure. Mr. Sutherland raised a warning hand to check the tide of nervous excitement which threatened to sweep over the entire crowd, but it was of little avail. Piercing screams followed. Women fainted and were borne from the room, and the faces of strong men blanched to a deathly pallor as they gazed from one another in mute consternation and bewilderment. For a few moments the greatest confusion reigned, but when at last order was restored, and Mr. Whitney had regained his composure, Mr. Sutherland inquired, "Mr. Whitney, do you identify the dead man as Hugh Mainwaring?" "I do." "But did you not identify as Hugh Mainwaring the man who at Fair Oaks, on or about the 8th of July last, came to his death from the effect of a gunshot wound?" "I supposed then, and up until the present time, that it was he. There certainly was a most wonderful resemblance which I am unable to explain or account for. But this, beyond all question, is Hugh Mainwaring." "Will you state what proof of identification you can give in this instance that was not present in the other?" "Hugh Mainwaring had over the right temple a birthmark, a red line extending upward into the hair, not always equally distinct, but always visible to one who had once observed it, and in this instance quite noticeable. I saw no trace of this mark on the face of the murdered man, but as the face was somewhat blackened by powder about the right temple, I attributed its absence to that fact, and in the excitement which followed I thought little of it. On the day of the funeral I also noted certain lines in the face which seemed unfamiliar, but realizing that death often makes the features of those whom we know best to seem strange to us, I thought no further of the matter. Now, however, looking upon this face, I am able to recall several differences, unnoticed then, but all of which go to prove that this is Hugh Mainwaring." Ralph Mainwaring was the next one summoned for identification. During Mr. Whitney's examination, his manner had betrayed intense agitation, and he now came forward with an expression of mingled incredulity and dread. But, upon reaching the casket, he stood like one petrified, unable to move or speak, while no one who saw him could ever forget the look of horror which overspread his features. "Mr. Mainwaring," said Mr. Sutherland at length, "do you know the dead man?" "It is he," answered Ralph Mainwaring in a low tone, apparently speaking more to himself than to the attorney. "It is Hugh Mainwaring. That was the distinguishing mark between them." "Do you refer to the mark of which Mr. Whitney has just spoken?" "Yes." "What do you mean by designating it as the distinguishing mark between them?" Ralph Mainwaring turned from the casket and faced Mr. Sutherland, but his eyes had the strained, far-away look of one gazing into the distance, unconscious of objects near him. "It was the mark," he said, speaking with an effort, "by which, when we were boys, he was distinguished from his twin brother." "His twin brother, Harold Scott Mainwaring?" queried the attorney. "Yes," the other answered mechanically. "Do you then identify this as Hugh Mainwaring?" "Yes, and the other, he must have been. No, it could not be. Great God!" Ralph Mainwaring suddenly reeled and raised his hand to his head. Mr. Whitney sprang to his assistance and led him to his chair, but in those few moments he had aged 20 years. A number of those most intimately acquainted with Hugh Mainwaring were then called upon, all of whom identified the dead man as their late friend and associate. These preliminaries over, Mr. Sutherland arose. "Your Honor and gentlemen of the jury, before proceeding with the testimony to be introduced, I have a brief statement to make. Soon after the commencement of this action, we came into possession of indisputable evidence that Hugh Mainwaring, the supposed victim of the Fair Oaks tragedy, was still living, and that of whatever crime, if crime there were associated with that fearful event, he was not the victim, but the perpetrator. We determined at all hazards to secure him, first as a witness in this case, our subsequent action to be decided by later developments. Through our special detective we succeeded in locating him, but he, upon finding himself cornered, supposing he was to be arrested for the murder of his brother, attempted suicide by shooting. The combined skill of the best surgeons obtainable, though unable to save him, yet prolonged life for 3 days, long enough to enable 2 of our number, Mr. Barton and Mr. Montague, to reach him in season to take his dying statement, a statement not only setting forth the facts relating to the will in question, but embracing also the details of the Fair Oaks tragedy and mystery. This statement, made by Hugh Mainwaring and attested by numerous witnesses present, will now be read by Mr. Montague." Amid an impressive silence, Mr. Montague stepped to the side of the casket, and, unfolding a document which he held, read the following: "I, Hugh Mainwaring, freely and voluntarily and under no duress or compulsion, make this my dying statement, not only as a relief to the mental anguish I have endured for the past few months, but also in the hope that I may thereby, in my last hours, help in some degree to right the wrong which my life of treachery and cowardice has wrought. To do this, I must go back over 25 years of crime, and beyond that to the inordinate greed and ambition that led to crime. My brother, Harold Scott Mainwaring, and I were twins, so marvelously alike in form and feature that our parents often had difficulty to distinguish between us, but utterly unlike in disposition, except that we both possessed a fiery temper and an indomitable will. He was the soul of honor, generous to a fault, loyal-hearted and brave, and he exacted honor and loyalty from others. He had no petty ambitions. He cared little for wealth for its own sake, still less for its votaries. I was ambitious. I loved wealth for the power which it bestowed. I would sacrifice anything for the attainment of that power, and even my boyish years were tainted with secret envy of my brother, an envy that grew with my growth, till, as we reached years of maturity, the consciousness that he, my senior by only a few hours, was yet to take precedence over me, to possess all that I coveted, became a thorn in my side, whose rankling presence I never for a single waking hour forgot. It embittered my enjoyment of the present, my hopes and plans for the future. But of this deadly undercurrent flowing far beneath the surface, neither he nor others dreamed, till, one day, a woman's face, cold, cruel, false, but beautiful, bewitchingly, entrancingly beautiful, came between us, and from that hour all semblance of friendship was at an end. With me it was an infatuation, with him it was love, a love ready to make any sacrifice for its idol. So when our father threatened to disinherit and disown either or both of us, and the false, fickle heart of a woman was laid in the balances against the ancestral estates, I saw my opportunity for seizing the long-coveted prize. We each made his choice. My brother sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. His rights were transferred to me, and my ambition was at last gratified. Between 3 and 4 years later, on the night of November 17th, within a few hours preceding his death, my father made a will, revoking the will by which he had disinherited his elder son, and restoring him again to his full right and title to the estate. This was not unexpected to me. Though no words on the subject had passed between us, and my brother's name was never mentioned, I had realized for more than a year that my father was gradually relenting towards the son who had ever been his favorite, and on the last day that he was able to leave his room, I had come upon him unaware in the old picture gallery, standing before the portrait of his elder son, silent and stern, but with the tears coursing down his pallid cheeks. When, therefore, on the night preceding his death, my father demanded an attorney be summoned, my feelings can be imagined. Just as the prize which I had so long regarded as mine was almost within my grasp, should I permit it to